Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again as we continue walking through the book of 1 Samuel. We should actually get ourselves to the point where next session we will finish this book. And so today, as we pick up where we left off, David had just again spared Saul's life. And we're going to see that David, though, still doesn't trust Saul. In fact, he flees to the Philistines. And all of these next three chapters are kind of setting us up for this battle of Gilboa, for really this last battle that we see Saul face. And so as we work through these three chapters, we should be able to get through these fairly quickly. That's kind of our setting. The setting is this impending battle, this impending doom that's about to come upon Saul and upon his family, and truthfully upon the nation of Israel as a result of Saul's sin. And so let's start with 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 1. Then David said in his heart, "Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand." So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And so David thinks to himself, well, I'm going to flee from Israel itself. I'm going to journey into Philistia because Saul's not going to chase me there. And actually, in fact, in some respects, maybe this is reflective of Saul's already kind of continued failings as king. We've talked about this as we've been working through this book, but Saul repeatedly had opportunities to go and strike out victories for the Lord and instead had let other people fight those battles for him. And we see David perhaps kind of keying in on that and realizing, if I flee to Philistia, if I flee to the land of the Philistines, Saul's not going to chase after me. I'll be able to rest in security from these continued threats. Notice just how backwards that is, that David feels like he has to leave Israel in order to be safe. He has to go to these Gentiles, to these Goyim, to these heathens to be safe, rather than being amongst God's people. It's certainly reflective of just how bad things have gotten. As you can see on the map here, Gath is really the closest Philistine city to Judah. This is the Pentapolis. There were 5 major cities of the Philistines: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Gath, of course, is where Goliath is from, and David has fled there previously. A few chapters ago, we had seen David flee to the city of Gath in chapter 21 of 1 Samuel. And there's an interesting thing to note here. David flees to the city of Gath, and he comes across Achish again. And Achish was the king or the ruler of Gath that we had seen back in 1 Samuel 21. And yet I have suspicions here that this is actually a different king. That as we talk about the kings of Gath, perhaps Achish is less of a name and more of a title. And there is some precedent for this as we look in Scripture. Actually, if you go back to the book of Joshua and Judges, there are a couple of accounts that deal with the city of Hazor. And as they fight against Hazor, they come across this king named Nabin. And in both of these cases, it's the same name, but several hundred years separate these events. And what we've come to realize is that Nabin was the title that was used for the king of Hazor. It wasn't necessarily his name, it was his title. Just like maybe you would think of Pharaoh in Egypt or President in the United States of America, Nabin would be a title. I think we see a similar thing happening with the Achish in 1 Samuel. I think this Achish is the ruler, because if you'll recall correctly back in 1 Samuel 21, David escapes from Philistia largely because he pretends to be insane. Well, obviously he's not coming back and acting insane now. We're going to see that Achish has a great deal of trust in David. This is not the kind of trust you would have if someone had already lied to you repeatedly, and now you're recognizing that lie. And so my suspicion here is that Achish is the title of this king. And so this is a new king in Gath. We're not sure how much time has passed between David's first journey to Gath and this journey to Gath. We estimate that David's on the run in the wilderness for about 7 years, is probably our best guess. So somewhere in that time frame, 5 to 7 years, he's been on the run, and now he returns to Gath. Verse 3, "And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him." And so we see that David's plan actually works. He flees to Philistia, and Saul stops his pursuit. He's no longer going to chase after David, because to do so would be an open declaration of war. For Saul to just move that probably 15 to 25 miles, somewhere in there, from Israel into Gath would be an open declaration of war, and Saul's not going to do that. He doesn't trust that God has his back against the Philistines. He never has. And so he's certainly not going to do that as he seeks after the Lord's anointed, after someone that Saul actually does know is going to be king one day instead of him. It's interesting to note here, Achish actually shows a great deal of hospitality to David here. It says that all of the men in their household are able to stay in Gath. We typically think really differently about what a city looks like. We are used to these just massive cities in America or throughout the world at this stage of the game where they're just filled with people. Gath is not going to be that. It's not going to have enough hotels to put up David and the 600 men in his army as well as their families. People are probably being kicked out of their homes in order to accommodate David and his troops here. Which is just fascinating to see just how God blesses David even in the midst of these enemy lines. Certainly, I think we're supposed to see the Spirit at work in just how trusting of David we see Achish being. Verse 5, Then David said to Achish, If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given me in one of the country towns that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? And so we'll see here kind of David's wisdom as he uses his verbiage to get what he wants. He wants to get out from under the watchful eye of Achish, the ruler of Gath. And in order to do so, he humbles himself before him. He says, Look, I don't deserve to be in the royal city. I'm just a humble servant. If you could just give us our own land, and maybe there is some kind of desire for self-preservation here from the Philistines. Look, we don't want these Israelites here. They've got their own religion, their own ways. We don't want those customs infecting us. We want them separated out. But David plays on that fear, frankly, that sinful fear that I think a lot of us often have as we see people who are different from us. He plays on it and he gets what he wants. He gets sent down to Ziklag. So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And so Ziklag then is probably about 25 miles south of Gath if you head down into Judah. And Ziklag becomes property of Judah from this day forward. It was a Philistine city, it becomes a Judean city. And the number of the days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. So for 1 year and 4 months, David lives behind enemy lines, away from God and his people in this foreign land. I don't know what kind of persecution he faced. It doesn't sound like much, actually. Again, we see God's hand in this. But we can certainly understand that this isn't an ideal scenario for David. And yet even here, David is going to be doing the will of his Lord. Verse 8, Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. Pardon me, sorry, I forgot I had this slide. We've got this image here, actually, of where we think Tel Ziklag is. And it's fascinating as we kind of dig into the archaeology. This hill where the city of Ziklag was, you can maybe see a little bit of where they've been doing some of the digging on the screen. As they've dug down into the different strata, into the different layers of the ancient city, because typically the way these cities would work is they kind of build on top of one another. They get destroyed either in an attack or a raid or something, and on top of the destruction you would build. And so we dig down and we have a rough idea, we think, of when those various strata were, when those times were. This certainly was at one point a Philistine city. There's clear evidence of that in those strata, and yet around the time where David was supposed to reign, we see that it switches over into an Israelite city. So certainly we see that archaeology supporting our understanding of the scriptures. But as we think about Shur is a city. This is all the way over in Egypt. You can just see the bottom of the Dead Sea over here. Typically, and I'm not sure why this map doesn't have it, there's a little brook that runs here, and that's typically considered the boundary line of Egypt. The Kidron Brook, the Brook of Egypt. And basically, when Israel gets to its full might under David and Solomon, it's going to extend to that line to Egypt. But we hear here that David pursues these Canaanites of various sorts, Geshurites, Girzites, Amalekites, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. This entire wilderness is the wilderness of Shur. He probably is just driving them to that wilderness, just to the other side of that river of Egypt. But isn't it interesting that even here in his exile, David is pursuing what God has commanded for his people? If we recall back to Joshua, we do recall that God commanded that all of the Canaanites be completely driven out from the land, because otherwise they were going to affect God's people. They were going to be a thorn in their side. They were going to lead them into idolatry. They were going to hurt Israel by their own sin, by their own idolatry. And so God demanded that they be sent out. Now, Israel did not fulfill this promise. And in so doing, we see them give way to that idolatry time and time again. And frankly, it's not comfortable to hear these images of God, and yet God is God and we're not. And so even in the midst of these things that are uncomfortable for us, at least for me, we do have to trust his goodness, his justness, his righteousness as we look at some of these things. But David is living out that command. And when Achish asked, "Where have you made a raid today?" David would say, "Against the Negeb of Judah, or against the Negeb of the Jerahmeelites, or against the Negeb of the Kenites." So David is really going down into shore, and he's kicking out all of those Canaanite peoples as he does so. But when he goes back to Achish, he says, "Well, actually, I'm going down into the Negeb." So instead of going to the shore, instead of going to the southwest, he says he's going a little bit southeast of Ziklag into the Negeb, into Judean territory. And so this is why in verse 11 we hear, "And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking lest they should tell about us and say, 'So David has done.' Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking he has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel. Therefore he shall always be my servant." What Achish is saying here, look, he's going and he's fighting against his own people. How will his own people ever bring him back if he's taking all of their stuff, if he's striking them down and taking the stuff and bringing tribute to me? His people will never accept him back. And so that what he says there, "he shall always be my servant," he's specifically referring to a type of servant in that culture. As we think about servants, about slavery would be another word that we can see used to describe this. It's very different from kind of our American conception of slavery. Like, you could sell yourself into slavery for a set time in most of these cultures. Typically in Israel, it was 7 years. But at the end of 7 years, if your work as servant, as slave was pleasing to you, if you loved the person that kind of was your boss, your master, if you felt like you were well taken care of, that they provided for you well, you could get a sign of some sort. In Israel, it was an awl in the ear that would mark you as a forever bondsman, as an eternal servant of whoever, of your master, of your Lord, of your protector. And Achish is specifically saying he's going to be that for me. It's not just like he's going to be my servant forever. He's going to be a forever servant. And I think we see here then just how much so God is working in this situation to protect his servant David, even while he's in a foreign land. Meanwhile, though, back in Israel, we hear another negative story about Saul. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for a war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, "Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army." And David said to Achish, "Very well, you shall know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." Notice again how David's words are shaped in such a clever way that he's not revealing his true intentions. I think as we dive into chapter 29, we're going to see this very, very clearly. David is saying, "Very well, you'll see what your servant can do." He's not saying he's going to fight for Achish. He's saying, "You'll see just how good of a warrior I am." He's not clarifying who he's going to fight against. And I think his intention is, in fact, to turn on Achish, to turn on the Philistines, and serve Saul in that regard. But Achish is blind to this and totally trusts David and says, "Awesome. After you do that, I'm going to make you my bodyguard for life. You're always going to be with me, my servant." Now, Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah in his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. And so the Philistines come to Shunem, which is an Israelite city. This is an active declaration of war, and they set up camp here. And they say, "We are going to fight against Saul here. This is where we're going to make our stand." This valley of Jezreel runs between Shunem and Gilboa. If you're looking closely at the map, you can see Mount Gilboa referenced here, but basically this entire little stretch of hill is Mount Gilboa. And so the Israelites gather on Gilboa, looking out to the north to Shunem, where this Philistine camp is. And Shunem, the Philistines are looking across, and the battle's going to be waged down in the valley, like we talked about. This was a huge advantage for the Philistines because they have chariots. They have the weaponry and armor that's going to help them in those valleys, and that's partially why they've chosen the spot. They're going to force the Israelites to come through the valley where the Philistines are at their strongest. And when Saul sees this army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. He looks at this situation, and he's filled with fear. There's no trust here, no faith, only fear. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. You can only imagine here that rejection that Saul feels as king. Certainly there's this sense of futility, this sense that the Lord is against me. I can only imagine that this furthers that fear as he's trying to ask the Lord for guidance, and the Lord is silent. So then Saul said to his servant, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servant said to him, "Behold, there is a medium at Endor." And so Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. So as you see on the map here, Endor is actually to the north of the Philistine camp. So Saul gets in his disguise and crosses the battle lines at night. In the dead of night, Saul sneaks across past the Philistines to go to Endor to go get this medium, this witch's interpretation of the future. And he said to her, "Divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you." Now, I have to admit, anytime I think of Endor, my first thought is of these little guys, of some little Ewoks on that forest moon of Endor. But as we picture what comes next, we actually are picturing something of a terrifying tale. This really kind of essence of evil that's happening here as Saul is so struck by terror that he has to turn to witchcraft, to sorcery. And this is a reminder that we do believe that witchcraft and sorcery, they do exist, and they are things that God has forbidden. These are things that we don't want to mess around with, that God has said are not safe for his people, that they open doors to evil, to wickedness that we don't want in our lives. And so, for instance, things like Ouija boards, soothsayers, horoscopes, those are things that God doesn't really want us to engage in. He wants us to trust in his plan for our future rather than desperately trying to seek out greater wisdom or knowledge or unseen. And frankly, our culture is obsessed with this occult. This is something that our culture finds fascinating, which is fascinating to me because there is oftentimes this push for materialistic only, and yet I think we sense that there is something immaterial there, something spiritual. And it's scary and frightening and honestly tragic that I think there are many people in our culture that are turning to evil things as they try to seek out that spiritual. But anyway, Saul says to the woman, "Divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you." The woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death?" I have a suspicion here that the woman knows that this is Saul. If you'll recall correctly, Saul is basically a giant himself. He's head and shoulders taller than everybody else. So there's only so much you can do for a disguise there, right? I mean, when you're 6'8", you're not going to be able to disguise yourself as 5'9" Pastor Zach. Like, it's just not going to work. This is a tall man. I think he's probably pretty distinctive. He's probably pretty kingly in his appearance, even in his disguise. And I wonder if the woman isn't quite fishing here, trying to see if Saul himself isn't here to entrap her. Because remember, he's put out all the mediums and necromancers from the land. He's done what God has commanded. And now he's sought one out. Because he feels so trapped, so desperate that he doesn't know where else to turn. And so now he's going to turn to evil, to frankly, the realm of Satan. But Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Notice the irony in this, the tragic irony. Saul is swearing by the name of the Lord, by the name of Yahweh to this woman, that she will experience no punishment for directly disobeying the commands of the Lord. This is directly from Leviticus, from Deuteronomy. God has said, you shall not engage in this. This is not good. This is not safe. I don't want this for you. And Saul is saying, by that Lord's name, who has condemned this act, I will protect you. But regardless, this vow is good enough for the woman. She says to Saul, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" And he said, "Bring up Samuel for me." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." And so now we see for sure that she knows that this is Saul. Notice what she does when she sees this apparition, this vision. She cries out. And I wonder if there isn't some fear there because something has appeared when she wasn't expecting it to. Notice again, she's the only person that can see this. Saul can't see it at this point. She sees it. And she's terrified. And this makes me often think, at least about some of that occult that we see a lot of fortune tellers, a lot of soothsayers, we think of as con people, and I think there's probably some truth to that. You be vague enough, you give just the right amount of details without being too specific, you can typically give a passable fortune, something that people are going to latch onto when they see it. And yet, I think here we do see that fear arise when something really does show up, when this apparition comes. And the king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What do you see?" So it doesn't seem like Saul can see this apparition. And the woman said to Saul, "I see a God coming out of the earth." This again just reflects the majesty of what she sees. Elohim can be used in this way. It would be the same word that's actually used for false gods on a regular basis. So she's not saying that this is the God or a God. My Bible in particular has it lowercase. She's saying that this is some impressive figure coming up out of the earth. And Saul said to her, "What is his appearance? What does he look like?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. And so this figure comes up. The woman alone can see it, and she tells Saul that he's distinguished by his age and by this robe. And this robe features prominently in Saul's life. If you recall correctly, when Saul lost the kingdom, he reached out begging Samuel to come with him and tore the robe of Samuel. And Samuel said to him, "Just as you have torn this robe, so too shall the kingdom, your kingdom, be torn out of your hands." That robe is emblematic of Samuel's priestly/prophetic office, and it features prominently in Saul's story. So this is why he hears of this robe and thinks to himself, this has to be Samuel. And he bows down and pays homage. Notice he's almost worshiping Samuel, which of course is sinful as well. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." Saul says, "Look, in life you helped me. Maybe in death you'll help me, because no one else will. I don't know what to do." And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke to me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David." We hear those words again. "Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines." So while Saul can't see this apparition, he apparently can hear it. He has this discussion with it, and he receives these harsh words, these words of condemnation, this promise that Saul is going to die on the very next day in this battle of Gilboa. And of course, as we finish 1 Samuel, we'll see that Saul and his sons do die, that Israel is routed in this victory. And so oftentimes people have thought to themselves, well, clearly this is Samuel offering God's prophetic law in Saul's life, saying, look, you're dead. It's over. Nothing you can do. And yet, as I look at this story, as I think about it, as I've read through commentaries, there's another theory, and I think this is probably what we should actually see happening here. I think this apparition, whatever it might be, is a demonic presence. Because think about this for a moment. Would God really allow his saints at rest to be called up by the wicked? To be pulled out of that rest in Christ, that rest in the Lord, that peace that we know in paradise as we await the resurrection, the new heavens and the new earth? Would God really allow evil people, witches, witchcraft, to summon his people from that rest? I just can't imagine that he would allow wickedness to have such sway over the departed souls of his people, over his people at rest. And furthermore, what does this spirit actually say that's that bold of a prediction? Saul is facing practically insurmountable odds. The Lord has abandoned him, so he doesn't have help coming from that front. He's facing a superior army, a bigger army, with better weaponry, with better soldiers. The expectation, I think, would be that he would die. And I think that demon then would offer up this just horrible vision. And we'll see that Saul takes this vision totally to heart and is just a wreck for the rest of this chapter. Nothing can help him. That utter abandonment, that utter law, that utter speaking of death, that feels to me more like the realm of Satan than of God. Of this God who gives us law, yes, but also gospel. And so I think what's happening here is that some demonic presence of some sort does make itself known in the situation strictly to terrify Saul. And frankly, we do know that Saul had had issues with the demonic previously. I mean, that's what we see David playing his music to stop that evil spirit that's afflicting Saul. So this is nothing new in his story, but we do just again see this great tragedy that as Saul continues to try to seek out the Lord, he seeks him out always in the wrong place. And so instead he's met with evil instead. It really is a tragedy, and certainly as we think of this story, it is just a reminder to us of why we don't dabble in these sorts of things. These aren't for God's people. We know our future, frankly. Details, all right, you got me. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I do know the end game. I do know that Christ is Lord, that Christ has died and risen again so that we might have everlasting life, and that one day he's coming back. And that when he does, he's going to bring us into an everlasting kingdom that shall have no end. The dead shall be raised. All who believe in him shall rejoice in eternal peace and glory in that new heavens and new earth. We know our future. We don't need to go hunting for it. We don't need to go searching for it. We don't need to interact with evil. Now, if evil comes to us in our lives, we're to speak Christ because Christ is stronger than that evil. But we're not to go hunting it out like this. This is a mistake and one we should avoid. Verse 20, then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. He's so terrified to the point that he can't eat. He's not sleeping. He's, frankly, probably dealing with severe anxiety. And the woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now, therefore, you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way. He refused and said, I will not eat. So this seer, this soothsayer, this witch, this medium is trying to, at least in some way, lift up Saul. How tragic is that? That that's the only place he can find solace, is this heathen. But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he listened to their words, so he arose from the earth and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fattened calf in the house, and she quickly killed it, and she took flour and kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread of it. And she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. So Saul leaves this scene of terror, having been at least somewhat nourished bodily, but obviously still with just no spiritual sense of conclusion, no spiritual sense of hope, no faith in the Lord. And again, I actually, just to clarify that statement, I don't know whether we'll see Saul in heaven or not. I suspect so, because I think he did trust in Yahweh, even if it was brokenly, even if it was unfailingly. But we do see that here at the end of his life, he's filled with despair and terror, abandoned by Yahweh because of his sin. Verse 29, or chapter 29, now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. So again, we're actually jumping back in time now before the Philistines get to Shunem. They're down in Aphek, and they're going to travel up to Shunem. But as the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish, the commander of the Philistines, said, what are these Hebrews doing here? And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? And since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day. So the rest of the Philistine leaders are watching as the army is getting ready to move out. They're overseeing this process, and they see David at the back of the troop, which probably is reflective of the fact that David is viewed less prestigiously in this culture, in this Philistine culture. And they say, Achish, what are you doing? Why do you have these Hebrews with you? And Achish is so blinded by it. He says, look, David has been perfect. He's never done anything wrong for me. I've never found anything at fault in him. But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, send the men back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. So the Philistine leaders basically are pointing out to Achish, look, this David has repeatedly destroyed us in battle. We can look back several years and know this. Yeah, he's been with you for 1 year and 4 months, but think about who he is. Think about how Israel has sang about him, the one who has struck down 10,000s. He struck down your giant. He struck down your champion. And while I think this Achish is a new Achish, a new ruler of Gath, certainly that would be a cultural story that would stick with you. Like you would remember about this young lad who struck down your greatest warrior. That would be a part of your story, even if it was a part that you wanted to hide as much as you could. And they're pointing that out, and they're saying, look, the only way, if everything you say is true, if he really has become a stench to his people, the only way he gets back is by fighting us, by giving our heads on the platter to his former king. So no, send him back to Ziklag. We're not going to deal with this. So then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, notice here, Achish actually uses that Yahweh. He uses the name of the Lord. Perhaps we see David here rubbing off on Achish. Perhaps we see David's faithfulness being reflected here. You have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So now go back and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. So Achish says to David, look, David, I know you're a great guy. I know that you've been helping me out. I know that you have been fighting against my enemies. I have no worries about you. I know that there's no fault in you. You've always been honest with me. Again, there's irony here because that's not true. But the rest of the Philistines, they don't trust you. So let's cut our losses. You peaceably go home. There will be other opportunities for you to serve me. But David said to Achish, but what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Notice again the cleverness of David's words here. Who is he going to fight against? The enemies of his lord the king. Who's his lord the king? It's Saul. David, even here, is planning this. And again, notice how carefully he words it. What have you found in your servant from the day I entered? Have you found anything? This is not even lying about the fact that there is stuff there that would not please Achish, that David has been lying, or at least shading, or no, he's been directly lying. But there's this, again, this hidden truth here that, look, you haven't found anything. It's there, but you haven't found it. And look, I want to go fight. I want to fight against the enemies of my lord the king. I want to fight against you. Although clearly he's not saying that. Notice just how, again, clever David is as he's dealing with this entire situation. And Achish answered David and said, I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said he shall not go up with us to the battle. Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning and depart as soon as you have light. So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So whereas David returns back south to Ziklag, the rest of the Philistines continue on their way until they get to Shunem, where they're going to strike this battle against the Israelites. And it's interesting to me, perhaps even here we do see God's intervention. God has always said that he's going to put David on the throne. And we see it here through his defeat of Israel in this battle. And I'd have to imagine that if David had been there, if David had turned on the Philistines, that wouldn't be the case. So it is interesting how even evil, this evil of warfare, God takes and uses for his good. Certainly that should be a reminder for us as we see evil all around us. But we have a God that's stronger than evil, a God that we trust in like David to see us through even the darkest of days, even through our journeys in the wilderness, knowing that he has a better future in store for us. And you know what? Maybe we won't see those blessings in our earthly life. Maybe we'll always deal with suffering and strife and struggling. Maybe things will even get worse than where we're at now. I pray to God not. But we do know that our God works all things together for his good, a good that is encapsulated in our suffering servant and our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Let's close with a word of prayer. Lord God Almighty, we thank you for this opportunity to be in your word, to be reminded of the faithfulness of your servant David, as well as to see the unfaithfulness of your servant Saul. Lord, guide us in your truth so that we might faithfully serve you, that we might be people that trust you even in the midst of difficult circumstances, and that we might be people who are filled with hope, because we know that you work all things to our good, that you have sent your Son to die for us, and that we have an eternal kingdom, an eternal future that nothing can take us away. Lord, we ask all this in the name of your Son's most precious name. Amen. Thanks again for being with me today, and next time we will finish off 1 Samuel chapters 30 and 31 before diving into 2 Samuel. Thanks. Hope you have a great day and blessings on your week.